So last week, we read scripture of the sort of the first part, almost the first part of the story of Abraham and Sarah, before they were named even, Abraham and Sarah. Generations later, we come to the story of Moses. You remember, in the meantime, Abraham and Sarah's descendants, years and years, the Hebrew people, they had ended up in Egypt. Years after that, generations after that, they had become slaves in Egypt. And so Moses, remember, was born as Hebrew, but was found by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised by the Pharaoh's daughter, raised as a prince of Egypt. And then the time comes when he's grown into adulthood. And as a young adult, we hear this story now in the second chapter of Exodus, starting with verse 11 and going through most of verse 15. One day after Moses had become an adult, he went out among his people. His people would be the Hebrew people, remember? And he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He looked around to make sure no one else was there, and then he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When Moses went out the next day, he saw two Hebrew men fighting with each other. Moses said to the one who had started the fight, "Why are you abusing your fellow Hebrew?" He replied, "Who made you a boss or a judge over us? Are you planning to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" And then Moses was afraid when he realized they obviously know what I did. When Pharaoh heard about it, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses ran away from Pharaoh and settled down in the land of Midian. So Moses ran. We usually don't tell that part of the story. We usually just tell the parts of the story of Moses that is triumphant, right? Moses, to this day, is the greatest hero in the Jewish faith. He's a great hero in the Christian faith. He's a model of the faith. And so those are the parts of the story that we tell. We tell about him saving the people of Israel. We tell about maybe the story of him coming to Pharaoh's daughter in the river. But the story of Moses taking the people out of Egypt and into the promised land, the land, remember, if you do, that's the same land that Abraham and Sarah came into, and now they've returned home later under Moses. That story of the Israelites returning to the promised land starts with Moses running, which means we have something in common with Moses. At least I do. I'll let you speak for yourself. Moses, in the story today, of course, he's running from a confrontation. And running from a confrontation, in this case, it really makes a lot of sense, right? Moses is afraid he's going to be killed, so he runs. But generally, we're better off when we don't run from confrontations, even though it's hard to do sometimes. Generally, if you want to resolve something, well, you have to try to resolve it. And so generally, having the conversations with people is the best way to do it. If you're holding something against a person or if they're holding something against you. Matthew 18, by the way, gives us a framework for how to do that, particularly in the church. So the idea that we talk with each other to resolve things is a biblical concept as well. But Moses, anyway, back to Moses, he ran from Egypt. He ran into the land of Midian. And once he was in Midian, he ran again. Here's what happened. While Moses was in Midian, he encountered a bush that was on fire, but not burning, and it wasn't being consumed. So we call it the burning bush. It really wasn't burning down, though. It's kind of a misnomer in some ways. And you remember what happened then? God appeared to Moses, or spoke to Moses in the bush. God told Moses to go to Pharaoh and to tell Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, to free them from Egypt, and then they would return to the promised land. And do you remember that Moses said, "No"? You remember that part? Yes. Some of you do. That's great. Here's what actually happened. Moses is asked by God and to do this great task, to do something, used in our song. And Moses answered God's request with a question of competency, to say, well, you realize I can't do this, right? And basically God said, well, yeah, you can. And then Moses came up with another excuse, and God said, yeah, that's not going to cut it either. And 4 times, this happens 4 times. Moses asked 4 different questions to try to show God that he's not capable of doing what it is that God wants for him to do. And then finally, when God answers all four of those questions with good, reasonable responses, Moses basically just says, well, yeah, I just don't want to do it. At least he's being honest, right? So have you ever been there? When you hear what it is that God wants you to do, and you just say, yeah, I don't want to do it. It's actually a pretty common story for pastors who oftentimes hear the call to be an ordained pastor, and then they'd say to God one way or another, they say, yeah, I don't want to do it. And then years later, they'll come back and accept that call that they had. But I want you to remember, this is really important, I want you to remember that particular call, the call to be an ordained minister, that's just one kind of call. And that God gives a call to every person to something. You're called by God to something. And so you have a chance to respond to that call that God's placed on you. But are you going to do it? The simplest call, the one that all of us share in common, is the call to relationship with God. And of course, one of the ways that we do that is through prayer, and that's an important way that we do that, to come to God in prayer. And I want you to know, I'm going to make a confession to you in a moment, but I want you to know that I have a prayer list. I have, if you ask me to pray for you, I will pray for you, and I will put you on my list. And so I have a number of folks or situations that are on my list. I also have on that document, I have this document stored on my Dropbox, so I have it at the church, I have it at home, I have it on my phone, wherever I am, it's there. And I have the Wesleyan Covenant prayer on that document as well. It's a beautiful prayer. And so, theoretically, every day, I pray from that list, and I pray the Wesleyan Covenant prayer. But sometimes I just don't want to. Sometimes I get busy with something else, or sometimes I get overwhelmed, or sometimes I just don't want to hear from God. And I don't want to pray. Or sometimes I just forget. And I'm actually kind of coming out of one of those places right now for 2 or 3 weeks. Just in a place where I don't want to hear anything else. I got enough. You ever been there? And I'm pretty compulsive about my to-do list. I've actually put pray on my to-do list to make sure that every day I can be accountable, not just to God, but to myself as well, to make sure that I actually do that and check that off, because I need to make sure that I do that. And there's just points that come in our lives when we're just not quite there, where we just feel like we might be just done for right now, not wanting to pray, or doubting God's presence, or doubting God's will, or knowing God's will like Moses, but just not wanting to do it. That happens too, and that was where Moses was. He knew what God wanted from him. He just absolutely didn't want to go there. But God didn't give up on him. God let Moses say what Moses needed to say. And then God said, okay, I hear you, but we're going to do it anyway. And then Moses finally, along with his brother Aaron, they pestered Pharaoh enough with a whole lot of help from God that the Pharaoh let the people go. And even in the wilderness then, along with their sister Miriam, they led the people up to the point of the promised land. And even in the wilderness, that place where in the Bible, wilderness is used as a place of trouble. It's used sometimes as a place where God is not present. But even in the wilderness, God was present. God was leading them. God was with them. God was helping them all the way along. God never gave up on Moses. God never gave up on the Israelites. God was with them all the way. It reminds me a little bit of when I was 7 years old and I ran away from my home. My mom was being incredibly mean to me. She told me to clean my room or something like that, and it was awful. If you know, some of you know my mom, and if you know my mom, you know that if she couldn't be mean if her life depended on it. Like, So that really, telling me to clean my room is really about as mean as my mom would ever get. So she told me something like that, and it was just clearly something that a 7-year-old child should not have to do. So I was done, and I was going to run away. I went up to my room. I remember this. I went up to my room, and I packed my stuff. And she walked up behind me, up to the door, and she watched me pack and asked if I needed any help. I said, no, I've got it. And I went downstairs to the kitchen to get a snack. I didn't know where I was running. She asked me that. She said, where are you going to go? And I said, I don't know, which is probably why I needed a snack. I didn't know how long I was going to be, journeying. I don't remember what I got. If it was available, I would have gotten some bacon for sure, because I love bacon. I learned last night at the Royals game, by the way, that 4 strips of bacon weighs the same as a baseball. Did you know that? The things you find out on National Bacon Day. Anyway, I went to the kitchen. I got a snack. After I got the snack, my mom was there in the kitchen watching me as I got the snack. She followed behind me as I went from the kitchen to the front door. Our front door, when I was growing up, there's a front porch and then stairs that come to the left that go down to the driveway down below. So I went down the stairs, and I knew that I was not supposed to walk on the street, and so I didn't do that. I wanted to be a good son, particularly since I was running away and all. And so I walked across the driveway and into the yard of the neighbors next door, and my mom stood on the front porch, and she was watching me as I walked, and then I heard her call out my name. She said, David, and I stopped. I think part of me felt like I really needed to run away at this point. She called my name, David. She said, you don't need to run away. I felt like I did need to run away. I had to save face, which, by the way, is a horrible reason to do anything. But that was who I was as a kid. It was like 2 years later when I called the police to tell them that my dad was a communist. And as I was dialing that rotary phone, as I was dialing the phone to call them, I was praying as I got to that last number, Dad, please stop me. Dad, please stop me. And I was so glad when he finally did, and when he hung up the phone on me so that I couldn't call the police because I was on the last number. I had to save face. I told them I was going to call the police to turn him in as a communist. And if you know my dad, that would be like the worst insult ever. So I had to save face. I was not always an easy child. So Mom said, David, you don't need to run away. And I think part of me still felt like I needed to, but I stopped. I remember this. I stopped and I sat down in the grass in the neighbor's yard, and my mom walked down the stairs and across the driveway and into the yard, and she sat down by me. And we talked. And then we hugged. And then we got back up and we walked back home. Little kids oftentimes think about their parents as gods, these incredible creatures that can do anything. Anything is possible for a parent when you're a small child. In that moment, my mom was like God, that she never gave up on me. And she let me say what I needed to say, she let me do what I needed to do, but she never left me. She never left me. She was always by me. We cannot go where God will turn away from us. We cannot go where God will not follow us. We cannot go to a place where God will not be. God is always going to be with us no matter where we go, and in that way we will always be home because we will always be with God. God was with Moses when he was a baby floating down the river. God was with Moses when he was taken by Pharaoh's daughter and raised. God was with Moses when Moses said no to God. God was still with Moses as Moses finally said yes. God stayed with Moses all the way until the Israelites were on the brink of the promised land, at which point we forget sometimes Moses died, not entering the promised land, but God was with Moses up until that moment when Moses took his last breath, and then God was with Moses even into eternity. And so God will be with you through all of that. And there's nothing you can do about it. I'm going to finish by just reminding you of a couple of things real quick as your pastor. I want to say, first of all, as your pastor, I know that there will be times when you feel like running. I know that there might even be a time when you feel like running from here. And I just want you to know that if you ever feel like you need to run from here, I don't want you to do that. But if you do, you can always come back. Whether you're gone for a week or for a month or for a summer or for a year or for 5 years, you can always come back. The doors of the church will always be open to any person who wants to walk through the doors. So you're always welcome back. The second thing I want to remind you is that the single best way, if you want to make sure that you don't run, the single best way to do that is to be connected to some other group of folks within the church. We're a big place, and so it's hard to, it can be hard to find your place in the midst of that. Last week, if you were here last week, you'll remember we walked you through the in-fellowship program that we have, the online database that helps you to connect with the church and with things that are happening in the church. If you weren't here last week, on the back of the bulletin on the bottom, you'll see a QR code that you can scan that will take you to that site, or a link there that you can just type in, and that'll take you to that site as well. There's 45 different groups right now that are listed on the in-fellowship portal. There's more that are still to be added, but right now there's 45 different ways that you can connect to other folks that are within St. Paul's. And the best way to make sure, if you're going to run, you're going to run to somebody. And we want to make sure that if you're going to run to somebody, that you've got some folks here that you can run to and that you can be with. So I hope that you will take a look at that if you haven't already. Get yourself signed up on the in-fellowship portal and find a way, find at least one of those groups that you can connect with and to be in relationship with, and that'll help you on your journey.